Hello and welcome to our Secrets and Lies event. Thank you for joining us via Ealing Libraries. I'm here with local authors Marianne Holmes, Ruth Heald and Nicola Rayner. I'm Catherine Patterson and I'm passionate about local libraries. In 2019, I hosted an event for Ealing Libraries interviewing Nicola Rayner about her debut novel, The Girl Before You, which The Observer described as the new girl on the train and a debut to look out for. I'm very pleased to welcome back Nicola, this time to talk about her second suspenseful novel, You and Me. Hi, Nicola.
Hello.
Also here to talk about her second novel is Marianne Holmes. Hi, Marianne.
Hi there.
Marianne always wanted to be a writer, but it wasn't until her youngest began playgroup that she started to pull together stories that became her first novel, A Little Bird Told Me. Today we'll be finding out about her latest gripping thriller, All Your Little Lies. And completing the trio, it's Ruth Heald.
Hi.
Best-selling author of 3 psychological thrillers, The Mother's Mistake, The Woman Upstairs, and I Know Your Secret. Since her first psychological thriller was published in 2019, Ruth has sold over 150,000 across 40 countries. And her next book, The Wedding, is out in March. Now, but let's see the books that we're going to be talking about today. So we've got All Your Little Lies, I Know Your Secret, and You and Me. I know we're all looking forward to delving a little deeper into your novels, and without giving too much away, we'll be talking about the themes that tie them together in Secrets and Lies. But for those watching, it would be great to get a flavour of each story. And I asked you to each treat us to a short reading, but first tell us a little bit about your book. Nicola.
Hi, Catherine. Well, You and Me is about a woman called Fran, who's in her 30s. She's quite lonely. She works in a bookshop. She lost her mother relatively recently, and she's estranged from her sister, and she doesn't have a whole load of friends. The one source of sort of joy and hope in her life is this crush she has on a guy she went to school with called Charles. And she sort of lingers on the edge of his life and watches him from afar and thinks and hopes and believes that one day she and Charles will get together, and he's the person who's going to sort of rescue her and save her from her loneliness. The novel opens on a tube platform, actually in the passage I'm going to read, and she witnesses something quite sinister, but she hopes that this will be the thing that perhaps can lead her closer to the man of her dreams.
Okay, well, let's hear that excerpt. Thank you. Thank you for setting the scene so beautifully.
On my way home, I spot Charles's face through the crowd on the tube platform. He's still wearing his work suit, the charcoal one. He's loosened his burgundy tie a little. He still looks smart, if weary. His blonde hair is cropped short now, not long enough to be pushed off his face as it was at school. It sometimes takes me by surprise when I catch a glimpse of him these days, how much he has changed. I take a step towards him, pleased to have this opportunity, but then I see Dickie Graham is with him, and I hesitate. At school, Dickie always played the Joker, with his broad freckled face and messy brown hair, making him look like a Just William illustration. He was the sort of child a teacher dreads in their classroom, lurking in the back row, seeing his purpose there to make fun of everyone and everything. Charles, of course, was always different, always kinder, but Dickie's presence makes me cautious about approaching. Circumstances are against us in any case. Thursday evening, at the time when the world heads home after drinks. It's 11:20, and the platform is crowded, the train delayed. I was about to give up before I saw Charles, on the cusp of elbowing through the wall of people and making my way home, above ground. The sight of his face makes me hesitate. Should I wait a little longer? The sign says the next train will arrive in 2 minutes, but it hasn't changed for so long that no one believes it. A few more people squeeze onto the platform, and then a few more. They keep coming, and just when you think we're at maximum capacity, more people filter through. The air down here is warm and stale. I'm not of a panicky disposition, but I'm conscious there are too many bodies pushed together, blocking any way out. As I give in and start to make my way slowly to the exit, I strain to keep my view of Charles. He always held his drink well. He's not one to overdo things. Dickie, on the other hand, is swaying gently. I'm far enough away for him not to see me, but in any case, he looks distracted, as if his mind is somewhere else. He fishes in his pocket, searching for something, pulls out a packet of cigarettes, and glances down at it absent-mindedly. Charles seems to remind him he can't smoke here, and Dickie smiles and pushes it back into his pocket. But it's a wan, preoccupied smile. Marriage problems, perhaps. It's possible his wife has seen through him already. A group of women begins to trickle in, all sparkly tops and pink lipstick, clutching their programmes for a 70s sing-along at the Royal Albert Hall, shrieking at each other in wine-fueled tones. They push and shove their way onto the platform. Perhaps they're out-of-towners and don't know this sort of crush isn't normal, that there's a limit to the number of people the platform will take. Irritated, I continue shuffling my way to the exit, like a swimmer paddling against the tide. Now I'm nearer to him, I can see Dickie is still swaying, standing too close to the edge of the platform. That's Dickie all over, seeing how far he can push something. A breeze picks up then, the change in the air pressure warning of the arrival of the train at last. The crowd shifts like water, bodies pressing and pushing against each other towards the edge, where the train will be any second now. There's a shriek of laughter, and a hen party, dressed up for the concert, with mullet wigs and oversized sunglasses, jostles its way between me and Charles. At the sight of the train appearing from the tunnel, everyone squares up for the scrabble to get on. I catch another glimpse of Charles. We're not far away from each other, but the scrum of women is wedged between us now. All I can see are the backs of their heads, some of them wearing those stupid wigs, others with hair styled neatly in bobs or worn loose to their shoulders. I fancy I see a cloud of white blonde hair that makes me think of Ellie, alongside another, brown and unkempt like my own. There's a fierce energy to the movement of the crowd, a touch of malevolence that makes me think of the Furies, demanding blood vengeance. They're not going to stop pushing. The fear must be catching. There's a panicked shriek and someone calls, "Watch out!" The words seem to pull Charles away from the yellow line. He draws away as the train rushes in. Next to him, Dickie glances back over his shoulder at the hen party and his expression changes. It's a half smile, as if he doesn't know whether to be happy or worried, and it could be that moment of recognition or the fact he's not looking where he's going that causes him to stumble sharply and fall in front of the train.
Thank you, Nicola. Gosh, that scene on the platform, very atmospheric.
Thank you.
And Ruth, I wonder if you could set the scene for your excerpt and tell us a little bit about your novel.
Sure. So mine is about a marriage counsellor called Beth, and she's helping other people, but her own partner has just left her with a 4-year-old. So she's feeling very alone, very isolated, but her life is helping her clients. And in this context of her in quite an unstable position, a new client comes in called Danielle, but she's not everything she seems. And then the book plays out as a power play between the two women, and as it goes on, you don't know who's telling the truth and who's lying.
Okay, so let's hear that.
I'll read a little bit from it now. I've wanted a baby for so long, Danielle says. When I married Peter, I thought children would follow. She wipes a tear from the corner of her eye, trying not to smudge her makeup. Her body has hunched in on itself on the sofa. I'd change if a baby came. If I had a child, they'd be the centre of my universe. It would be so different from my own childhood. My ears prick up at this, wondering what kind of childhood she had, wondering if she's subconsciously trying to put something right, trying to correct something. Okay, I say, hoping she'll continue. Danielle looks at her feet. There's something else. Something, he says to me. I know it's not true, but it makes me feel awful. It undermines my confidence. She shifts her weight from one side to the other on the sofa. What does he say? He says he knows me better than anyone, and he can tell I won't be a good mother. I resist the urge to tell her that of course she'll be a good mother, like I would say if she was a friend, not a client. I wait as she dabs her eyes. I'm so sorry, she mumbles. I didn't mean to break down. I've just been trying to keep everything together. Her body shakes. It's okay to feel this way, I reply, my words sounding inadequate in the face of her distress. She stands suddenly. I think I need to go. Anxiety radiates from Danielle and I speak softly. You can say what you need to say here. There's no judgment. She hesitates for a second, then shakes her head. Why don't you take a minute to calm down? I indicate the sofa. Can I go to the toilet? She asks. I just have some time to regroup. Why don't you regroup here? I need the toilet anyway. She smiles through her tears, suddenly calmer. Two birds with one stone. I pause for a moment, reluctant. I forgot to clear up after Charlie's bath. I don't want her seeing his bath toys, a reminder that I have a child and she does not. But I can't think of a reasonable objection. Sure, I say, pulling the door open. It's at the end of the corridor. I hear her feet padding down the corridor past Charlie's room, then the bathroom door shutting behind her. I stand and walk over to the window. On the street outside, there are seated commuters hurrying back from the underground station, heads down, and I imagine them rushing back to their families. I feel a stab of jealousy as I fold my arms, comforting myself. Tonight I'll be in this house on my own. No Richard, just me and Charlie. Suddenly everything that's happened today comes rushing back to me. I think of our son in his bedroom alone without Richard here to keep an eye on him. I must check on him. The door to Charlie's room creaks as it opens, and I hold my breath, hoping I won't wake him. He's snuggled up, his little chest rising and falling under the duvet, his mop of dark curls resting against the pillow. His arms are wrapped around his cuddly penguin, and his other soft toys line the bed behind him. He won't part with them, no matter how many times I suggest that he might have too many. I straighten the duvet around him and turn to leave. My heart aches for him as I think of the baby he was and the man he'd become. I feel the weight of responsibility for him, my child. He looks so peaceful, unaware of what the future holds for him, unaware that tonight will be the first night of many without his father. I love you, I whisper to his sleeping form. I stand to go, but I can't take my eyes off my son. This moment seems so precious, and I want it to cling to it, knowing it can't possibly last forever. A cat screeches outside the window, and I turn. There's a shadow in the doorway, silently watching me. Danielle.
Right. So much in that reading there. Thank you, Ruth. And Marianne, if you could tell us a little bit about All Your Little Lies.
Well, All Your Little Lies is about Annie, who's quite a lonely person and desperate for some kind of human contact and social interaction. And when a local girl goes missing, she really, really wants to get involved and help, and begins to believe that she might have information. So she calls the police and embellishes what she's seen. And that little white lie leads to many more. So I'm going to read an excerpt from the beginning of the book where Annie is trying to work out if she recognises Chloe. Annie woke with a dry throat. There was no way she was going to get back to sleep until she'd drunk a lot of water. It took her a few moments to come to properly and shake off the dark wings of the dream that still flapped in her head. Fear twisted in her stomach as she swung her legs out of bed, and she listened hard before removing the wedge that held her bedroom door shut. The familiar ticks and sighs of the house ambushed her anew as she stepped down the stairs and into the kitchen, bracing herself for the bang of the pipes as she ran the water. She left the kitchen lights off so the outlines of plants in the garden were visible, but no one outside could see in. The bones of the honeysuckle trembled along the fence under the rain that still fell. The furried catkins of the pussy willow she planted the year before jumped in the feeble moonlight that leaked through the racing clouds. Annie refilled her glass a second time, the spray spattering droplets down the front of her dressing gown. The lonely hours before dawn exposed her old nightmares, and sleep was unsafe. She couldn't risk sinking back into those dreams again and being trapped in the wild disorder of images and noise. Instead, she had to sit and nurse the fainter tangle of decades-old memories. Sunshine, wet rocks, shards of glass throwing rainbows on the carpet, and hiding in the footwell of a speeding car with a blanket over her head. They tumbled over themselves, calling for her attention. This morning, it seemed that the shadows were more insistent, more nagging, and she fought to control her panic as anguish flooded her mind. She knew there was something wrong now too, but the details were murky. This was how her brain acted. It tapped into a lifetime of guilt so that she couldn't unravel her latest failure from the first. Annie checked the bolts on the front door reflexively as she passed and picked up the Standard. She climbed back into the hollow she'd left on the sofa last night to read it properly. There was something about that picture of Chloe that had been flickering in and out of her dreams all night, spurring them on again when she thought they might subside. The girl was walking away from the camera. They'd chosen a still when she turned her head to the side, arcing her hair back over her shoulder to reveal her pale face and the direction of her gaze. As if she'd been checking a noise behind her. Annie caught her breath. In her head was a sudden image of another child looking back at her. The thought of her whispered across her mind like so many other images that she couldn't shut out. Now that Annie had seen numerous photographs of Chloe in colour, she didn't need to study this dull imitation of the girl's face. She knew her eyes were blue and the tips of her long hair were lighter than the rest, as if she'd dipped them in a pot of paint. The headlights of the car behind Chloe created a dazzling halo effect, so that her features were blanched and indistinct anyway. It was as if Chloe was already fading away when the image was taken. Annie blinked, the pain behind her eyes playing with her vision. Carefully, she smoothed the paper out on her lap and looked at the whole picture. She'd been so focused on trying to recognise Chloe that she'd concentrated on the face of the girl alone. The curve of Station Parade in the background was lit up by the streetlights as it bent around the small island of grass and up towards the main road. If the camera had panned a little to the left, it would have picked up the alleyway through to Paul's apartment block. Some mornings, Annie would slow her walk to the ticket office, hoping to see him emerge so they could travel on the train together, but it had never happened. She felt a moment of pain as she thought of him joking with the others in the pub after work, wondered what he'd said about her, how much they'd laughed. She pushed the thought away and concentrated on the image, searching for whatever had triggered this particular night of broken sleep. The highlights of the car behind Chloe obscured its registration plate and left the windscreen a blank, so that the driver was invisible. Annie assumed the police would already have spoken to that driver anyway, and then she knew they hadn't. The glow from the streetlights along Station Parade behind was just enough to outline the distinctive shape of the car's near side mirror. It stuck out at an awkward angle from the tangle of masking tape that held it together. She dropped the paper. It had taken her nearly half an hour to wind enough tape around that mirror to keep it in place.
Thank you, Marianne. And just like Ruth and Nicola, in those readings, you've just given us so many nuggets that will only become unfolded when you read the whole novel. So thank you. Thank you, twists and turns, even in just a few minutes. So thank you all very much. Now, one of the things I'd like to talk about is isolation. All of your characters are pretty lonely and quite isolated, and that's something a lot of us can relate to now, especially with what's going on at the moment. But I think you started writing before we were in the current situation, and I just wondered what inspired you to create these women and their solitary lifestyles. Perhaps I'll start with you, Ruth. You talked about Beth. She's at home on her own with her son. So
yeah, so I think secrets and loneliness often go together, because if someone's holding back something in a secret, then they can feel lonely, I suppose, in a crowded room or even with friends. So I think the loneliness in my characters really comes from that feeling of not being fully themselves and from hiding things. I also think that living in London, loneliness is everywhere really, and that people live quite separate lives even before the pandemic, and that the things you see on the surface are not necessarily what's going on underneath. And I think my characters are always, in all my psychological thrillers, my characters are always vulnerable in some way, and that vulnerability comes in part from their secrets, but also comes from this loneliness. I think it's a really interesting thing to explore how people, and Danielle is a lawyer in my book, she's a client. She actually on the surface has a very nice life, like a big house, a nice husband, all of these things. But because she's not herself really showing any of herself really to her husband, and she is kind of by default lonely. I just think that's really interesting thing to explore, the gap between who people are and what they present, and what that creates inside themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, some of the characters have deliberately isolated themselves. Nicola, would you say that was true?
I think it's really interesting what Ruth was saying about the loneliness. I think loneliness, I think it really helps in the writing of the sorts of books we're writing, because for me, the key thing about Fran and the place where it all started was her obsession with Charles. I heard a story from a friend about a woman in her 30s who kept turning up at the house of a boy she went to school with, and at strange times with like a full face of makeup and her hair all done, and he was happily married with children, and she just kept turning up at his house and asking for him. And my friend lived on the same well, they shared a post room, so the woman kept turning up in the post room. And this story really, she told me the story years and years and years ago, but it really, really stayed with me. And I think because I felt such sympathy for the woman, because I thought, imagine holding on to someone for that long. And it's something that, I mean, not to that extent, but certainly in the past, I've held on to people for too long, or had crushes for too long, and that that sense of doing that for decades really kind of captured my imagination. But when I started to investigate Fran more, I realized that to have that kind of obsession, the flip side of that obsession, in my mind at least, was the loneliness, because I don't think that obsession would come from someone, maybe I'm wrong, but who had lots of meaningful connections in their lives. So Fran had to be lonely, and hence her estrangement from her sister. She's still grieving from her mother, and she makes a series of not terribly good decisions. But again, I think the loneliness and obsession in my mind are very joined. It was a story that I started long before lockdown, and certainly Fran is a character who's been with me for a very long time, so it wasn't at all inspired by lockdown, but it was interesting to me that I was finishing it in lockdown, and finishing it in a year that, you know, so many of us are thinking about loneliness and isolation and these things.
When we talked last time, I remember there was a sort of sexual element to your previous novel, and that seemed to be coming up in the environment of the sort of Me Too campaign.
Yeah.
So I'm intrigued to see what you might write about next, Nicola.
Yeah, thank you. It's funny how things can just end up being kind of a coincidence. It is strange how that can happen.
Yeah, not prophetic, a coincidence. And Marianne, tell us a little bit about Annie.
Well, Annie, the character for Annie occurred out of my wondering about some of the high-profile police appeals that happen, and the sheer volume of calls that the police receive. And I was wondering whether some of those might be from people who didn't really have information but just needed to reach out for whatever reason. And so I started thinking about the sort of person who might do that. And years ago I worked for BT, and I remember the slogan, "It's good to talk." Some of the people in the call centre said that occasionally they get calls from members of the public who just needed to talk. So really that's where Annie came from. And I think the fact that she is lonely and has so few friends helps explain some of the really poor decision making, and the reason that she can be so obsessed with this case and what happens, that she doesn't have the perspective of somebody else saying to her, well, you know, hold on a moment, let's think about really what's going on here. And so that's really where she's coming from.
Yeah, no good friend to just say, hang on a minute, are you sure? Yes, I have to say, reading your novels and being in this time has really made me appreciate my friends. I think another element about that is the likability, because I did find at times your characters were doing things that just made me want to go, stop, don't say that, you've said enough, or don't do that. And, you know, it made me think about their likability. Do we think a character has to be likable? And also, I wonder, was I maybe a little bit tougher on them because they were women? You know, do we hold our women characters up to a sort of higher standard of likability? What do you think, Nicola?
Yeah, it's really interesting, this question of likability. I always think about what Margaret Atwood said about the qualities that we appreciate in a character aren't the same as we would appreciate in a college roommate. Like, you know, an interesting character and a character that attracts you as an author isn't necessarily going to be someone who's likable, and that isn't necessarily going to be what, yeah, no, that's not going to be necessarily what intrigues you and makes you want to explore someone. I mean, the buzzword that gets used a lot in publishing is relatable. And I think, I do think the character has to, I mean, I'm wary of using it because it's been used so much, but I do think the character in some way has to be relatable, or in some way you have to be able to get on their side. It's interesting for me with You and Me. So it initially opened with Fran witnessing the accident right at the beginning of the novel. And actually in the process of editing it, my editor suggested that we see Fran have a little bit of a normal day before she witnesses this accident, so that the reader can see that she's a very lonely person, as we said, that she's had a history of being bullied, that she just a little bit about her, without going too much about the loss of her, as I say, loss of her mother, the estrangement from her sister, so that when you come into her seeing the witness the accident, you're not immediately just seeing someone who's quite strange witnessing an accident and interpreting it in quite a peculiar way, but you're seeing someone who is very unhappy and who is very lonely, and who hopefully the reader is a bit on her side before you go into the accident. But I do feel, yes, I definitely feel that women do get a tougher time with this. I think with The Girl Before You, I knew I was writing some unlikable male characters, but my female characters got quite a tough time from readers as well. And I don't know, I think all of us, I don't just think women, but I think everyone expects more from women, and for us to be, you know, politer and sweeter and more smiley. And I think that's why sometimes female characters do get a tough time. I mean, is like Othello likable? Is Hamlet likable? Is Macbeth likable? I think this is a really, I don't know, it's kind of a weird question to me. The other thing I'll say is that I think when you're seeing something from someone's close point of view, like, it's really hard to make anybody likable. Like, inside our heads, are any of us likable? I'm not sure. Like, if you spend a day inside of my head, I don't know how likable you'd find me. So when you're kind of taking that angle and you're taking that view, I don't know. It's a tough one to make that nice and likable. It's really cool.
It maybe likable is the wrong word, but you just want to be able, when I'm reading something, I want to be able to root for the person, you know, I want to be on their side.
Yeah.
About that, I have to say I did struggle quite a bit with Annie, because the way she interacted with the people she met and her ideas, you know, the way she would articulate things in her head, I was going, she caused me probably the most problems, Marianne, sorry.
No, I think that's true, and I am quite interested actually in how we perceive other people and this idea of likability, and we do hold women to a higher standard, I think, but it's also very easy to make judgments and not really understand what's going on in a person's life. And I think, you know, lockdown has shown us that this year people are being more open on social media about what's going on. And it's a challenge to make a character human, whilst also being, as Nicola said, relatable, or still having that connection that makes you want to root for them. And I just think about the issue with holding women to a higher standard. There are a lot of male characters who are manly men, but in order to see them as having an emotional side, they quite often have a backstory of being widowed or divorced or some kind of problem. And I'm not sure we allow our female characters those same kind of backstories without judging them. So I think it's a really interesting area, and I think this genre is maybe opening up a place for women characters who have these complicated human backgrounds and therefore behave in ways that as a society we don't find quite so palatable.
Yeah, well, I was certainly challenged, and it made me just think about the lens that I'm looking at people through, and maybe sometimes I just need to be a little kinder, as you say, not judging. Now, Ruth, you're writing about two women and that relationship.
I think it's hard to write something that, well, it's hard to write a book everyone will like, for a start, but a character that everyone will like is even harder. Everybody has different friends, different tastes in people, I suppose, and that likability sometimes is conflated, I think, with a kind of moral standing. It's very hard, I think, to write a character that's both interesting and is very morally right all the time. So there's a real conflict there, and I think for me as a reader, I don't like the characters to be too likable, because for me, likable, I don't think to that extent is not as relatable, actually, to pick up on what Nicola was saying. But it's difficult, because certainly I'm always told to make my characters more likable, and I do try to do that. And as the others were saying, I do think women in novels tend to be held to a higher standard. It maybe depends a little on the genre. I've certainly heard from other authors that male characters maybe are held to a different standard. So not so much they don't have to be nice, but maybe they have to be strong. So a male character that doesn't stand up for himself, or stand up, that is perceived very badly. So I think it may be that we're just, I don't know, or people hold different genders to different standards and have different expectations of different genders. The other thing I'd say is that in a psychological thriller, you do need someone to make a mistake or to make a decision that's not quite optimal for them. And if people don't like people who sometimes mess up, then it would be very hard to write a psychological thriller where someone was never naive or never misread something or never made a mistake, because essentially we all do make mistakes, and that's certainly in my psychological thrillers where a lot of the drama comes from, like what happens after that mistake, how do they respond, how do they try and put it right. And without that, there's no book really. So I think it's a difficult balance between plot and character.
Yeah, you're right, because we're not just crafting characters, we're writing stories, so there needs to be conflict and problems and challenges and mistakes, as you say. So it's not as if these characters just sort of created in isolation.
Yeah.
And do you ever try out any of your sort of prospective mistakes on other people for reference, for believability? Or
what do you mean by try out?
Have you ever had an editor come back and go, oh, they wouldn't do that?
Oh yeah, all the time, actually. And it makes me think that my editor is probably a more likable person than me, because I would say that, or I would do that, in that circumstance, not in every circumstance.
Yeah.
There is that thing about likability when you've created a character. I mean, because I'm quite fond of Fran, and as I say, my editor wanted me to work on making her more likable. And when there's so much of you in a character, you're like, I don't know. It does feel a bit strange, as I say, when a character feels very personal. Sometimes they're not very likable. You're like, oh.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, as I say, I obviously was on side, because at every step you're sort of going, even if you are going, don't do that, you're going, come on, let's try and do things a little bit differently. But I have to say, one thing you've got to admire about the women in these novels is they've faced a lot of heartache. There have been secrets, and even deeper secrets in their past that are revealed, but they're all very resilient, which is something that's incredibly admirable. So
I think that's true of most people, isn't it? And I think you can see it at the moment in the pandemic and in lockdown, and that everyone's kind of carrying different things, but you can't see them on the surface, and you don't really get to any kind of an age without going through something. and people are carrying all this baggage that you just can't see it. So I do think that most people, if you spoke to them in depth about something personal, you would find were resilient, actually.
And some days courage is just putting one foot in front of the other, because the bigger picture is so overwhelming at that time. So yeah, courage comes in different packages, I think.
Absolutely. I thought about resilience a lot when in the writing of Fran, and I thought about sorry to quote Margaret Atwood again, but I thought a lot about Penelope and Odysseus and waiting for Odysseus to come home. And I was lucky enough to use a Margaret Atwood quote from the Penelope ad. I've always been of a determined nature, patient they used to call me. I like to see a thing through to the end, which I really liked for its kind of, because Penelope is famous for waiting, essentially. And actually the working title of You and Me was The Waiting Game, because Fran just thinks, essentially, if she waits long enough, then Charles is going to realise she's the one. So this idea of persistence and stoicism and waiting was really very much in my head in the writing of the book. But it's interesting to think of it as bravery as well, because I think in Fran's case I was thinking a bit more in terms of passivity. She's not really owning her life and taking control of her life. She's sort of waiting for Charles to rescue her. And I was thinking a lot about romance and how the maiden kind of waits to be rescued by the knight and all of that nonsense. And I think it's something that Lisa Taddeo talks about in her book 3 Women as well, about how women always end up waiting. So that kind of idea of waiting something out was very much in my head. And again, it's funny, isn't it? Because we're all waiting now for the vaccine and waiting to be the other side of this.
Yeah, well, I think the waiting thing is an interesting, because there's the absence and separation for a lot of your characters from other people, the people they want to be with. I mean, Fran in particular about Charles, and it really does resonate at this time.
Yeah.
One of the other things I wanted to talk about was power, the power that's in secrets and lies. And if people know our secrets, you know, where that leaves us, and how that changes the dynamic in relationships. I suppose with Danielle and Beth, Ruth, that's probably most evident. Yeah,
and I think the book is, I Know Your Secret, is very much about a power struggle between them. And that's because where does that power lie? Like you say, is it the knowledge of a secret, or is it in holding the secret, or is it in sharing the secret? And I think it very much, certainly in my book, depends on the person and what the secret is, because about revealing too much, some of the secrets I think are they're more culpable for them than others. And there's a lot of emotion around them, like there's shame, there's hiding the secret, like that need to conceal, and all of that creates a very complex power dynamic. And it means that sometimes Danielle can feel that the knowledge is power, but is she really powerful from that knowledge or not? And that knowing something about someone else when they don't know that you know it, creates, I think, a really interesting dynamic, as well as the things that are said and the things that are left unsaid, and how I suppose each of us in our mind forms a model of the people around us. So they've each got a slightly distorted view of the other, and the reasons that they think the behaviours that are happening are sometimes wrong. And it's just interesting, I think, how that can flip back and forth between them. And I think actually every single relationship you have has some element of a power dynamic, and I always find it really interesting to explore those and how those can flip around based on new information or things that happen. So
And as far as the information we give other people, social media, very important these days. And I mean, luckily for us, we have social media. Here we are. We can't meet in person. We're here on Facebook. But Nicola and Marianne, social media really plays a big part in your characters and how they, well, you tell me, how they interact with other people, and the sort of how they present themselves and how they get their information about people. So Marianne, what what made you choose such the social media?
I think there were a couple of things, and one was from Annie's perspective. She is sitting in her house looking at the lives of other people through the lens of their social media to some extent, and feeling envious that she is not at the parties or not making the connections that they're making. And then as the case goes on, she starts looking at what other people are saying about it online and getting caught up in this mass of emotion and conjecture and all sorts of information, and because she's on her own, it becomes quite obsessive. But the other thing as well was looking at how so many people do get involved and swept up in the emotion of cases like this, and certainly at the moment it's happening on all sorts of fronts, and that thought that people say things on social media that they wouldn't say to a person's face, that it's very easy to be brave and say we should go and, you know, right this injustice or challenge this person, and that has repercussions in real life. It spills out, and you can see, you know, the crowd behaving in a certain way that they wouldn't have done. That crowd wouldn't have come together without the help of social media making those connections and encouraging people into this sort of heightened state of emotion.
And I think Fran gets a lot of her connection from following people on Facebook. Isn't that right?
She does, because she's an outsider, and because she wasn't sort of one of the popular girls at school. She's still watching that kind of cool group from afar all those years later, and obviously Charles to whatever extent she can, and Charles's wife and his family. Dickie, who dies in the opening chapter I read, is someone who shares a lot on social media. So because Charles doesn't share so much, she's able to kind of trace what he's up to through his best friend. You know, I don't really like using the word stalker for Fran, but to the extent that she stalks, she is doing a lot of that through social media. I think it's such a gift as well, because, you know, it's all curated, isn't it? It's all presentation, the way we want our lives to be seen. So when you're thinking about things like loneliness and insecurity and jealousy and those sorts of themes that I was thinking about with Fran, social media is just a great tool for that, because it can make the most secure of us feel lonely and jealous and needy, because that's the way it works. So it's just as a plot device, it's fantastic for that and for dealing with those themes. And also because I'll have to say, without giving too much away, it's great for the smoke and mirrors of it, the trickery of it, to the extent to which you can trust what you're being told. So just when you're writing a thriller or a mystery, I just think it's just an absolute gift.
Yeah, absolutely. Beth, she uses the internet rather than social media. She does what a lot of us do when we need to go and meet somebody new. She Googles them. But you didn't actually use social media, so I just wondered, was there a reason for that? Or
well, I think when I originally came up with the concept of the book, I very much wanted it to be not quite a locked room thing, but I wanted it to be like the physicality of sitting in a room with one other person, and that dynamic of being face to face and that interaction. So I didn't put social media in it. It was very much more about what's said and what's unsaid. And they do know more about each other than they let on as well. So I think I actually chose really to explore a more physical dynamic, just to see how that could play out. And maybe that's a little, I don't know, old-fashioned, but
I think it's very refreshing in this day and age. Very refreshing to people face to face.
Yeah, and I find that idea interesting. I think of just that for power between two people who have only got each other's presence to go on and what each other is saying. I think when Beth Googles Danielle at the beginning, she's not really findable because she doesn't want to be found. So there's just not that avenue for them to pursue in quite the same way.
What about you yourselves? Are you big on social media? Do you find it useful? Or is it a fun thing, or is it for contact, you know, for being in touch with people?
It's really useful for writers, and I think most of us are encouraged to be on social media by our publishers. So yeah, I'm on social media. I think we all are. I think it's a very good servant, but a very bad master. I think it's good. I'm generally quite suspicious of it, and I've said many times I don't really like it. But actually, I also have met some wonderful people through social media, and it is, especially at the moment, it's a really nice way to be in touch with some of my friends. It's a fantastic way to be in touch with readers. So I shouldn't be quite as harsh on it as I have been in the past. But I still really have my reservations. And that documentary, what's it called? Is it Social Network? Or there's a recent documentary about it, which kind of solidified many of my worries and suspicions about it. In terms of also mental health and fueling anxiety, fueling insecurity, jealousy, all those things I've talked about before, it does concern me. But conversely, like I say, it can be a fantastic form of connection as well. So it's a tricky one.
Yeah, I agree. I think if we use it for connection rather than comparison, it will be a lot better.
No, absolutely.
But yes, I mean, you know, 2020, when we were due to speak first, and now 2021, absolute roller coaster. And I just wonder, as writers, has writing in lockdown changed a lot for you? Marianne?
Well, yeah, definitely going from being able to write during the school day in a lovely, quiet house to suddenly having everybody else at home, and also homeschooling has been enormously challenging. And I think when it first started, you know, we were lucky enough that we were able to survive all working at home, and it seemed like it would be for a short period of time. And so if schoolwork, you know, went by the wayside, it wasn't a big drama. But the longer it goes on, I do think it's getting harder for everybody, and we're having to find new ways of working and coping and being kind to ourselves, because this actually it is difficult, and you know, it is bringing out some good things, particularly with social media and people making contact with those people who perhaps were already isolated, and perhaps we'll have more empathy for those people. But goodness, yes, it's difficult, isn't it?
Ruth, how's lockdown been for you?
Well, I'd agree with what Marianne said, really, that the other thing that I've found is that especially in the first lockdown, the headspace to write is so important. So I found it very, very difficult myself to be creative. So I was writing the book that's coming out in March, The Wedding, and whereas usually I'd be kind of wandering around and my mind would be just thinking up all these ideas, like seeing little things that would be inspiration, and the story would just build in my head without me really having to do anything. When I sat down at the computer, I just typed it out. That wasn't happening because my head was spinning with everything else that was going on. So then when I sat down at the computer, it was a blank page and there was nothing in my head to transfer. So I think, and I know that for some other people, it's been a time where they've been enormously creative, and that's amazing. I haven't found it like that. I've found that it has negatively impacted my creativity. I think this time round, first time around, the challenge was looking after the children, definitely. But this time around, I think, like Marianne said, we know it's for a longer time, and the homeschooling is important, and they're just more. It feels like there's even more demands on everybody's time, and I think, like Marianne said, but being kind to yourself is really important, because actually, very rarely are you asked to do like your job and homeschool your children, and like you're doing a few jobs at once, and you have no outlet with leaving the house particularly or seeing friends, and that's an enormous ask of everybody. So I'd say I find it quite hard, but it's important to recognise that it is hard, and they were getting around that really. Yeah.
What about you, Nicola? Any inspiration? Can we expect anything to come from lockdown?
Well, I don't have children, so I don't have the challenge of homeschooling. But I would say I was finishing You and Me last year, so editing I didn't find too difficult initially in lockdown, and finishing it off last year. I'm working on my third book now, and actually that process, like Ruth said, is difficult in lockdown. And as I say, even if you don't have the challenge of homeschooling, there's still the problem of being very much in one place for such a long time, which is, for me personally, is not good for my creativity. It does feel a bit stagnant. I tend to go away relatively regularly to write. I like going to quite wild places in Wales and Scotland when I can, and even if that was like, normally I do go like, I don't know, 3 times a year, but then I do a lot of my big thinking when I'm out in the big open spaces. And I just find being in London all the time, just walking around my local park, nice as it is not the same. So I'm struggling with the thinking, actually. It's like my mind can't expand because my life is so kind of enclosed within these 4 walls. But we'll see. I've been playing around with some ideas. I have been writing, but we'll see. I'd also say I just miss the stimulation, even of little things like writing in my local coffee shop, or being on trains, or, you know, that's often where I'll hear an interesting conversation, or I'll notice someone, or I'll jot something down, and it's all about sort of engaging with the world and witnessing the world, and we can't do a huge amount of that at the moment.
No, which is why reading for someone like me is brilliant, because you literally take me into a completely different world. So yes. What about inspiration? Marianne, on your website, you've posted some things that have inspired you. And I think you've got a little one behind you, haven't you?
Oh, my goodness. Yes, so this is actually in All Your Little Lies. It's a sandstone figure that my parents bought when they lived in Belgium years and years ago. And it fits nicely in the hand, and it's really tactile and comforting. And I wanted Annie to be able to pick up something that she would relate to as hopeful and comforting. So I used this image, and it amused me as well, because in my first book, A Little Bird Told Me, there is a similar little motif as well.
So is that something you might be carrying forward to the next writing?
It feels like a challenge. Yeah, I probably should drop something in there,
like a little Easter egg, so that
yeah.
Yeah. And Nicola, when we last spoke, you talked about you'd been working as a journalist, and it takes you, what, your first novel was about 10 years in the writing?
Yeah, it was slightly less than that, but not far off. Yes, it took me a very long time.
But then, you know, here you are with your second novel. I'm just wondering, you're saying you're starting your third. Are things speeding up for you now?
Well, I had deadlines for my second novel. You don't really have a deadline for your first. It's just up to you. But with your second one, you know, you've got a publisher involved, and they had given me deadlines. And that, I have to say, that fear was a wonderful motivator. Yeah, it was quite stressful. It was quite stressful writing so quickly, but I think it was really, really good for me, and I feel like it has taught me how quickly I can write if I need to. I think my instinct is to be a bit more of a tortoise naturally, but I do think it was good to have the hare experience.
And what about you, Ruth? You've talked about the wedding. Is that going to be a happy ever after story?
No.
It's a psychological thriller.
No, well, I thought I'd ask.
Yeah, so it's about so she's planning her wedding, and she gets this note saying, you know, a threatening note, and it's everything's thrown up in the air, and as you go through the book you kind of don't know who sent this note, and the threat to her and to her husband to be just gets higher and higher and higher, and she obviously feels that she really needs to kind of continue regardless, because why should someone else ruin her wedding? But yeah, it was a really interesting book to write in lockdown, actually, when nothing was happening. Weddings were going ahead, and yeah, but the threat to her and to her relationship is very real. So yeah.
Okay, well, we look forward to that.
Did it make you miss champagne and parties? And...
a little bit. I mean, maybe this is why the book was quite hard to write, because when no one's doing anything, it's very hard to recapture from your memory all those social moments.
Yeah.
What people say and what people do and how people act. So yeah, miss it, yes, a little bit, but also just trying to relate to it was a little bit difficult. So, yeah, but it's out in March, beginning of March.
But I think you're right, Nicola. That's what's nice, is to be able to enter a world where people are still in touch and there's contact. You know, we can watch things, but you feel a little bit detached. When you read a novel, you're right in the middle of the action and you can place yourself among the characters.
Yeah. There's something more. I mean, we all have a box set, or at least I do, but there is something more nourishing about reading somehow, and it's calming as well. Whereas watching a lot of television or being on a screen a lot can make you feel more agitated. Even if it's not a stressful watch, it can just make you feel more tense just from having all that blue light. Whereas I think sitting with a book will always kind of calm you down.
Yeah. And Ruth, like me, used to work at the BBC, just talking about television. I wondered if that's something you might draw some inspiration of, or the real drama, the intrigue, the tension behind the scripts.
Well, I think I was very much office based, but any office is, again, so many power imbalances, so much politics. And I think there's a lot to be drawn on there about the vulnerability of people in office, because, you know, there are people at the top of the food chain, there are people at the bottom of the food chain, and people need the job to live. So I think that's something I would like to explore later on, like not specifically to do with the BBC or television, but just that kind of the power imbalances in offices, because that's something a lot of people can relate to as well, because most people have worked in an office and have seen the way people behave.
I'm just wondering for Nicola and Marianne, if now we're slightly limited in what we're doing, have you started drawing on things that have maybe in your past? I know, Marianne, you travelled quite a lot as a child, so I wonder if there's some inspiration.
Well, I think there will be lots of great plots to come out of the pandemic, but I'm certainly being more interested in escaping at the moment. I feel too in it right now, and I've been drawn back to a character from antiquity, Dido, who founded Carthage, and that's quite appealing to me. It's an old interest area of mine, and it allows me to think about a story that you know, that there's not a great deal known about her, so there's a lot of scope and potential for a bit of fun and adventure, and actually lots of research, which is a lovely way to procrastinate. So I'm enjoying that immensely.
Yeah.
Will you be exploring her relationship with Aeneid?
So that has always annoyed me immensely, that this woman who her brother the king killed her husband for his money, and she managed to get away with the money, with the fleet, picked up a company of people, founded an empire, and then Virgil has her commit suicide over a failed love affair. so furious about that. That she
really
has to have a better. There has to be a better story there.
So you will leave, yeah. So you will leave in and Aeneas out. That's.
I think so. I think yeah.
That's great, because she's really fierce at the beginning of, is it book 4 of the Aeneid? She's really fierce, isn't she? And you do sort of see her crumble.
Yeah, I think Virgil was trying to big up Rome at the expense of Carthage. So yeah, he used her as a tool to make Aeneas look good, and I'm not having it. It's not right.
Well, I'm going to be first in line to read that, Marianne.
Awesome.
Ealing to Carthage. Well, yes. Not make sure to do the writing, not just too much research.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So, have you? I know there'll be people watching this who would love to write themselves. Maybe they do, but they just haven't quite got round to being as brave as you and putting everything out there for people to read. Have you got any tips for them?
I think get started. Just start. Don't worry about the quality, and keep going, because you can learn the craft of writing and you can fix a plot. But what you really need is the stamina. There's a lot of words in a novel, and when you've written them all, they won't be all the right ones. So it really is. You have to start and then just keep at it and have fun.
And competitions, are they good things to enter? Nicola, you were runner-up with your first novel at the.
Yes, well, I would say yes, absolutely, because of my experience, and also just to add to what Marianne said, I think keep going is such good advice. I think persistence is just absolutely everything with writing. I think it's, whenever anyone asks me about it, I just think it's the only thing I could ever offer, is just keeping going and persisting, because it is such a long journey. But yes, I would recommend competitions. I think they're really good. I think the deadlines are really good. When you start writing, you often have a very long, you're just left to your own devices, and I think if you enter a competition, then you know, for example, in 2 months or whatever it is, you're going to have to have written 10,000 words or whatever they're asking for, and I think that's really, really helpful, having that deadline. It gives you good practice for what it's like when you're writing for an editor. And also, yeah, there's a great opportunity to get representation or get published, which worked out really well for me. So I would always recommend them.
Okay, Ruth, what about you?
In terms of competitions?
Yeah.
So when I was first starting out, I did do more competitions. The Amazon Breakthrough Novel Award was one. I was a quarter finalist in that. But I kind of did 2 kind of shots at this, I think, because that was back in 2010 when I published my first book. It was published in 2012, I wrote it in 2010. And then the second shot was when I was doing the psychological thrillers. And at that point in time, I was really set on the publisher that I ended up having, Bookouture. And that was what I wanted first, and then if I couldn't get that, I was going to look at other ways of getting into the industry. But I was very lucky in that Bookouture were interested, and so I didn't actually enter any competitions second time round. But I'd agree that they are a good discipline in getting me into that habit, and also just being willing to share your work, because I mean that's a big barrier for a lot of people, like writing in private, writing in secret sometimes, and people, you know, that has to be a step in the process, sharing your work. So I think it's a good thing to do, definitely.
Well, thank you. Thank you also from me, because your novels really were the perfect escape for me in lockdown. They really took me out of my own 4 walls, and with the twists and turns, I am a fan of the psychological thriller now, so thank you. So I'm looking forward to what comes next. Anyone watching, if you love a story that pulls you in, then these 3 novels are for you. Let's have a look at them again. We've got You and Me, I Know Your Secret, and All Your Little Lies. And if you'd like to support all things local and get your hands on signed copies, isn't that right?
That's right.
Yeah. Pitsanger Bookshop currently have signed copies for purchase. Check out their website, pitsangerbooks.co.uk, for contact details and latest information. But thank you all. Let's give ourselves a virtual round of applause.
Thank you.
So Ruth Heald, Nicola Rayner and Marianne Holmes, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you to Ealing Libraries for hosting us, and thank you to everyone who's watching. And novels, let's see the novels, because they'll want to look again. Go on. Thank you very much for joining us, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Catherine.